Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the Not Yet Adults podcast. I, of course, am one of your hosts, Collin Geffrey, joined by the one and only times three, Eric Zayas.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going okay, Eric. I'm gonna address the elephant real quick. I am sick right now, so if my voice sounds different, that's why. I'm getting through a cold. Fun story. My dad went on a business trip to Florida last week or the week before and came back, and now the whole family's sick.
That is such a fun story.
That's a really good story. Yeah, I especially like the part about how I'm sick now, so that's fun. But how's life going with you, Eric? What's been happening in Eric's world?
Well, I working, getting some errands done today in regards to insurance things with the apartment, and it's calling a bunch of phone numbers and doing this and that and the other thing. And also, I just got Red Dead Redemption 2. I didn't tell you this in the pre-show, but I got Red Dead Redemption 2. I've been playing that, so that's my latest obsession.
I am terrified of that game.
Why? Are you scared of it?
It's just way too big, way too much to do.
It is going to be a big waste of time.
I have the same problem with that game that I do with Skyrim and Fallout, is I don't want to start it because I know I'll never finish. And I kind of just don't even want to take the plunge. But I hear really good things. People are really liking it. All sorts of realism and whatnot. Apparently the horse balls shrink in different climates, which is painfully realistic.
I mean, I haven't taken a good close look at those horse balls, but the beginning, I feel like they do this on purpose, whereas the beginning of the game starts in a very snowy, cold area, and then the second chapter, your character is immediately moved to a place with a warmer climate. And I think that is for no other reason alone was to show off the realistic horse testicle physics.
Rockstar, man, they have the best technology in the business. It's pretty crazy.
But enough about horse testicle physics. Colin, I was wondering what you wanted to talk about today on this here podcast, partner.
Well, first of all, partner, I just want to say you can never talk too much about horse testicle physics. In fact, we should probably do an entirely separate podcast just about that. That said, there's been something on my mind lately, Eric, and it's probably something that's on a lot of people's minds that listen to this, and that is elections and voting. Yeah, here in the United States, we're at the midterms right now, which is basically the JV squad's big night, I guess, if you want to call it that, because your president is not up for re-election, but it is your 2-year Congress people. And some senators, I believe, as well.
So more state-related electoral stuff.
That's a really good point, too, is also your local government.
Yeah, the more local government stuff as opposed to, big, all-encompassing USA nation stuff.
Right, and then obviously there is some federal stuff where obviously your House of Representatives, they run for re-election every 2 years. And senators, I think, are on a 6-year re-election cycle. And so there's a whole lot of hubbub around this whole voting thing right now. We see it everywhere we look. I see it on my pre and mid rolls on YouTube. I see it on the side when I'm online. I see it on the TV when I'm washing dishes. Everyone is talking about this voting thing.
It's damn near unavoidable.
Darn near unavoidable, some might say. So yeah, I'm curious. I kind of just want to pick your brain. I don't really have an itinerary I want to follow necessarily. I just kind of want to talk about voting in kind of a broad sense. Like how do you feel about it? Where do we kind of come down on the pressure to vote and everything that comes down there? What's sort of your thoughts, just broad strokes, on the idea of voting?
It's kind of feels like a first world problem to complain about it, because I feel like I am annoyed by the pressure there is to vote, but also on the same token, it's a privilege to live in a country where we have a democracy and are able to choose the people that, or choose with everyone else, the people who represent us and make huge decisions that affects us on potentially life-changing scales. But also, there is definitely a pressure to vote and to have an informed decision, and there's a lot of people, I mean, myself included, who believe in the philosophy that you can't really complain about who gets elected if you didn't vote. It's definitely something that is more I have a lot more motivation to vote for during the presidential elections as opposed to midterm elections. Midterm elections, I feel are the ugliest. If the presidential elections are the older brother that is dominant and you want to hang out with. Midterm elections is like his younger brother that wants to hang out, but no one really wants to hang out with the younger brother.
It really is. Like, guys, you don't understand. We're from the same family and we do a lot of the same things. And you're like, get out of here. We're just here for the older brother. I think that's totally fair. You mentioned one thing that I kind of want to hone in on just to play devil's advocate for a minute. Sort of, if you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. And I don't want this to become a political episode, at least not in the binary sense of like it's us versus them. But I do want to bring this up. In the 2016 election, the majority of people voted for someone who did not win. As far as the presidential election went, the majority of the popular vote went to Hillary Clinton, while obviously Donald Trump is now president. And so, how do you feel? Or maybe what would you say to someone who says, well, my vote doesn't really count, when we see things like that, where despite the numbers saying one thing, and obviously there's a lot of fine text and asterisks on that, and you have the Electoral College and how all of that works. It's not cut and dry. But I have a hard time not listening, at least partially, to people who are frustrated because they vote, they put the time in, they go and do it, and even when the majority of people vote on one thing, it still doesn't get passed.
I think a better form of voting would be purely based on like popular vote, because the Electoral College, to me, seems like the way it's set up, it could be like manipulated, and could not manipulated in the sense of like corruption, but just in the sense of like it becomes more of a numbers game and less about like who the public actually believes should be the president. So in my perfect alternate version of the earth, the U.S. politics would work in the sense of like just a popular vote and not electoral college. But I believe that in order for the electoral college to be disbanded and popular vote to be the only way of government, I think it's like the House of Representatives that have to like change it, because it's based on like an amendment.
And if anyone out there is maybe works in government or is a political science major or anything,
please explain it to us.
Please explain it to us. For the record, we are not experts on this at all. We're very out of our element, but I do think it's an important conversation for us to have. I do want to say, just I had a whiff of a memory of something from a poli-sci class. I believe the reason that the founders of America did not want it to be a just sheer popular vote based government was because of the fear of mobocracy, and sort of that idea that the mobs, the masses, shouldn't necessarily be able to dictate something terrible. We need to have kind of safeguards in place so that if a majority of people don't know what they're talking about, we'll still be okay.
That makes sense. That speaks to like the checks and balances that make that I believe that is the only way democracy can work. If there are safeguards for everything. But it is just annoying. It just feels like your vote isn't as worthwhile, especially if you are a Democrat in a state like Texas, where your state's most likely going to go blue, and the electoral college votes are going to go to a candidate that you're not voting for. So it's definitely disheartening. But to the people who are disheartened by it, it's still important to vote, because not only is it a privilege that we just happen to have because we live in the United States, whereas other countries that's still not the case, and so we should take advantage of this choice we have. But also, it's just as small as your vote may count, it still counts.
Well, and I mean, you mentioned the idea of representation. This is anecdotal, so take it for what you will. But my grandfather, who's 80 years old, has lived in California since he was 7. And for pretty much all his life, he's been more or less a moderate, but he's a registered Republican, and he typically leans conservative on most things. Not everything, but most things. And I've had conversations with him that he feels like, well, does it really matter what I do? Because I'm in California, and California is always going to go blue, And so he feels like he still votes, but he feels discouraged by the fact that, in the grand scheme of things, his vote doesn't really decide much.
I just want to speak to what you said earlier about mob mentality, and I feel that in early America, when the founders came here, that was more a possibility, because, a majority of people who are kind of corrupt could have a higher chance of taking over and getting their candidate to win. Whereas in a world where in the information age, when everyone has access to all the information around the world, I feel like that's and also population has expanded and population has grown, I feel like that would be harder and therefore less likely to happen.
Well, and I think that's a valid conversation right there of how much has changed since this nation was founded and how much of the Constitution is not applicable, but how much of that really makes sense in our world today. I mean, I obviously it was made by people far smarter than us, but how much foresight can you really have? And so, we have some amendments that we talk about frequently, like the Second Amendment, obviously, is a big hot button issue. And then we have, amendments like the right to refuse quartering soldiers in your house, like, which freaking never happens. Like, we never talk about that because it just doesn't apply. And so it's hard of, having this foundation that was built hundreds of years ago. You can't just throw it all out and say, let's start from scratch. But at the same time, you have to wonder, is this really working for us?
I'm about to say something that's really controversial, so I just want to preface it by saying, like, what I'm about to say, my thoughts are my own, and this doesn't reflect, like, Colin's opinions or anything. What I'm actually about to say is that I believe that the Constitution, like, I think it's, like, probably the most well thought out documents of human history. But that being said, like, it's been like over 200 years since the United States declared its independence, and I think that no document can last that long and not be completely antiquated and not need serious, like, fine tuning and changes. But the Constitution is this almost like holy document. People treat it almost like the Bible, where people take it as something that can't be altered or changed or abridged at all. Which makes sense because it's such a smart document, but also, like, something like that has to do with laws that are meant to be distributed throughout the entire country. I think over the years, because, like, people change and evolve, and countries and cultures change and evolve, maybe we need to look at it and actually change it. But, like, who decides and how do we go about that? It's the difficult part.
I mean, that to me is not necessarily the most important part of it, but the more relevant part of it is logistically, how do you make that change happen in a society, in a government that is built the way ours is, with I don't hate all politicians, but let's be honest, with people that have very personal agendas and are motivated by not necessarily the most wholesome of things in all cases, of, like, how do you push change in a system that is as broken as ours? And obviously, as an American, we have a luxury to say that. We can say that on a podcast and put it up on the internet, and anyone can come listen to it. And not everyone in the world can do that. And, we're obviously very lucky for that. But it's frustrating seeing corruption and seeing ineptitude and seeing lack of progress and all these things happen in the highest levels of our government. And as a average citizen, knowing theoretically, yes, my vote matters, but a lot of the time it sure doesn't feel like it.
100%. There's this quote from Winston Churchill, which is, like, one of my favorite quotes from any historical person ever. And I might butcher it slightly, but I believe it goes something to the effect of, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. Which, of course, my interpretation at least is that, like, as much as we complain about democracy for its flaws, it's still, like, the best thing.
It freaking sucks, but everything else sucks worse. Yeah.
It's the thing that sucks the least. Yeah, it's the only thing that really works, even though it's flawed and even though there's, like, definitely corruption and monopolies and oligarchies that can be born from how it's formatted. Like, another, like, form of government is tyrannical, where, like, we have kings and queens of people that just, like, are in power because of bloodline rather than, like, democracy, and that I don't would work even worse.
Well, and what comes to mind, sort of on the subject of vote mattering and things like that, is last week Late Night had another episode, and they were lucky enough to have Victoria Woodards on. She's the current mayor of Tacoma, Washington. And she mentioned a story, and this is secondhand, so I'm sure I'm misquoting it, and people can go watch the episode and hear it for themselves. But the story was essentially that there was an election that happened somewhere in the world where literally the two leading candidates tied as far as the votes. They literally, down to the vote, had the identical number of votes, and the election was decided by grabbing a name out of a hat or something like that.
I've heard stories like that, and I've also heard stories of, like, the when two people running for office tie, the deciding factor is a coin flip. I've also heard that. So yeah, I think like, I mean, the smaller the election is, the more your vote counts, just because of like I mean, just like math, but also like based on if there's a huge number of people, there's much less likely of a chance of a tie. Like it's the more voters are, less possible it is.
And for the record, I'm not advocating to boycott voting. I'm not advocating that you shouldn't vote, because you should. But it is very hard in a nation like ours. We have an extraordinary amount of people in our country.
At least a couple dozen.
At least, if not more. And, when you compare it to the other developed nations in our world and undeveloped nations in our world, we have just an extraordinary amount of people in a relatively small space.
Mm-hmm.
And even in an election like 2016, that, say what you will about it, but it was polarizing. It was fairly close. You heard a lot of people on both sides. It wasn't one vote apart. It was still millions of votes apart. And it's hard as an American to feel like, okay, well, my one's going to make the difference, Because theoretically, yes, it does, but in practice, I don't know. I just don't know. It's hard to get excited about voting to me when, and we talked about this a little bit already, there's all this pressure to research these candidates. There's all this pressure to get informed. There's all this stuff to read about it. And I can't help but to think in my mind, in the back of my head, while I'm doing all this, does anything I'm doing right now really matter? Because at the end of the day, what's really going to happen? Probably the same thing that's been happening.
Well, using that logic, I think that kind of, the whole like, the bigger the election, the less your vote feels like it matters and seems to matters and mathematically does matter. Using that logic, midterm elections should be even more popular, because since it's smaller, like since it's based on local government, the populations are smaller, and therefore your vote does matter, because your vote holds more weight and has a better chance of swaying election in your favor, as opposed to the national presidential elections, which is a much huger, Jesus Christ, I'm like Donald Trump, much bigger pool of people, and therefore each vote just statistically matters less. However, those ones are more popular, and so more, I don't have hard numbers, but I imagine more people vote from those elections.
Well, and I think you touched on a really interesting point, which is, especially in the 2016 presidential election, the level of sensationalism that goes around national news. And it sounds weird, it is so much more fun to watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC than it is to flip on your local news where you hear about a raccoon that got out, because it is marketed and there's a budget behind it, and they have good talking heads and personalities saying things in a well-spoken way. It is just more entertaining to hear about what's happening at the national level, when in reality, the way our government is made, your local government, just in your city or your town, has a far greater impact on your day-to-day life than the federal government does, by quite a bit. And as you go further out, your state government, a little bit less power, federal government, even less power. And I don't have numbers to back this up, but I would assume turnout probably reflects that people don't vote as much in their local elections. And obviously we're in a midterm election right now, and that's where a lot of the local stuff comes into play a little bit more.
Honestly, watching the 2016 political debates, it's very interesting. And recently, this is gonna sound unrelated, but recently I've been watching the Rocky movies with my dad, and so I've been watching a lot of boxing. And a big part of boxing before the actual game, the two fighters are marketed, and there's their stories are told, and they're marketed to be enemies. And there's this what do you call it? Not press release, but a public...
Like a press conference, or?
Press conference, yeah. There's a press conference with the fighters before they fight, and they basically ask them questions, and their responses are usually yeah, I'm going to kick this person's ass, and they...
Which I always find odd in Rocky, because what the heck else are they going to say? Of man, I don't know, he's probably going to beat me. Like what?
It's not even just Rocky. It's in real life, too. That's how a lot of boxing matches are... what do you call it? Marketed as. And so the reason I bring that up is because watching that, I found so many similarities to those kind of press release boxing marketed functions. I found so many parallels to that, to those at conferences, than I did to the political debates, and like the candidates really, it's not even so much how they what they say to each other, but it's how it's marketed. And like the political candidates are marketed as characters who are enemies and who are fighting each other, and you like pick a side and like root for your character, as opposed to the midterm elections where there's not really that much characterization to the people being elected. There is a little bit in the annoying political ads we see constantly, but not nearly as much as the national elections.
Well, and I'm not saying this isn't true in other parts of the world, and this is partly speaking from a place of me being a little bit naive, but very much in America, we have sort of this competitive spirit that's sort of baked into what we are as a society and who we are as a society. And for people who enjoy politics or for people who are interested in elections and things like that, the presidential election we have every 4 years is essentially their Super Bowl. It's their enormous spectacle event that an obscene amount of money and time and ad space and all these things are thrown into, and it's very sensationalized, and there's very much a narrative that both sides are trying to pitch you, and it's fun because there's so much going into it. When in 2016 and leading up to that, I had friends that were never remotely interested in politics that were talking to me about the election, and that's because of the way it was marketed. It's because of who was involved. It's because of what they were saying and how they were saying it.
It really is like a big sports game. Like if you look at like uh, an election-based protest right before an election and compare that to like a tailgate party right before Super Bowl, like if you change the color schemes and some of the, like the logos to like political logos rather than like mascots or like Seattle Seahawks or whatever, it's very similar.
But here's the scary thing to me is I don't like football. I don't care about football. But let's say, for argument's sake, I really like a football team and you really like their rival. And I kind of give you crap and say my team's going to beat your team. But at the end of the day, we're having fun because we're both getting along over this common thing. With politics, if I really like one side and you really like the other side, not for everyone, but that could very much be a driving wedge in our friendship and relationship.
Yeah. And also, like, at the end of the day, sports don't matter. Like, they don't actually, I mean, like, there's, like, for the sports teams, there's a lot of, like, problems with, like, marketing if you lose and, like, with money and stuff like that. But in reality, when a sports team loses, like, within a week, people start talking about it. When a president wins the election, like, we're not done talking about it for, like, at minimum 4 more years, and realistically a lot more years after that. And because like the impact that an election have is obviously much more important than like who wins the Super Bowl.
Leading up to the 2016 election, I loved Trump, not because I liked his policies or liked what he talked about. I liked him because he made good television. It was exciting to watch. It was like watching a season of House of Cards. I was like, what the heck is he going to say next? This is ridiculous. Until you remember, this isn't House of Cards. This isn't a Netflix drama. This is real life.
This isn't Veep.
This isn't Veep, for God's sake. This isn't The West Wing. That's so terrifying to me of how similar, as you said, the way their sporting events and our top tier dramas on TV are marketed to our political coverage.
I have a friend who during like the very early part of the 2016 elections, when like Trump was just beginning to like be a part of the debates and run for president, we're at a party and he was saying like how he supports Donald Trump, and I was like, why? Like he's, sorry to use like coarse language, but like I think he's an asshole and he's a jerk and stuff. But he was saying that if you think of the all the members of the people debating and all the people running for office as like sitcom characters, he's the one that like is the most of a character and the most distinct and the most like, like if this was like, he's the one you like love to hate, so to speak. And so and that was basically his like main reasons for it. Like since then, I should say, like he's publicly, after Trump won, like and like all the problems that came from that, he's publicly said like, oh, I no longer support Donald Trump. But like at the beginning, before like all the problems with Donald Trump, like when he was just new, he was saying like, I support Donald Trump because he's the most like distinct character. If you look at politics like a sitcom,
he is an entertainer in every meaning of the word, and that's great for when you run a reality show. I don't know if that's great for occupying the highest office in our land. I feel like we have leaned a little bit more towards specifics than maybe we necessarily intended, but that's the show. I mean, it changes as we talk, and we kind of let it go where it wants to go. Um, we wanted to talk real quick. I think we're kind of there, but we had another run of show. How do you feel about these political commercials we're seeing? I know I was washing the dishes today, and I saw Will Ferrell in character as Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights telling me to vote on the TV. And I'm like, this is very strange and bizarre. And are we in 2007 right now? Like, what the heck's happening? And we're seeing that everywhere, freaking everywhere. Everybody's telling us to vote right now. How do you feel about the just obscene amount of publicity is not the right word, but ads and mind share that's going towards telling us to vote right now?
I like the ones that are fun and creative, and like the ones that are less about like supporting a candidate and just promoting the voting. Like, just like go out and vote. Not saying like vote for this particular person paid for by this association, but like, hey, don't forget to vote. It's really important. Those I'm perfectly fine for. The ones that are like, so and so is an evil person and hates puppies, and this other person is great and loves, puppies. That I hate those so much. And there's so many of those, and they're really annoying. And I just tune them out so hardcore because it's an oversaturation of like people shoving their like thoughts down my throat, I feel like.
Well, and I think you touched on something really important that I don't know if we have time to talk about in depth, but to me that brings up when you see those attack ads or puff pieces or whatever you want to talk about it, that's very strongly leaning towards one side. I have the same reaction you just said, which is, well, I'm going to tune it out because clearly this is, biased. But that's not the right response. That's not what we should do. We should say, okay, well, I need to go research what's actually happening there and figure out what these people, do they like puppies? Do they hate puppies? Theoretically, that's on us as the consumer and as the informed citizen to go do that. But who does? Not many. Definitely not myself. I'm not pretending to be up here in my ivory tower right now.
I think that's a good takeaway from this episode, if there is one. That like not only as much as we are complaining about like how often like voting doesn't feel like it matters as much, but regardless of that, it is very important to vote. But also, it's important to look past the rhetoric and do your own research and actually look into all the candidates and make an informed decision to vote, as annoying as that is. And I know we're talking about how much like pressure there is to vote and do research on voting, and I'm just adding to that pressure. But like, I think the takeaway is this is paid for by no one because this is free. But yeah, I think that if I had to like leave like a bookend to this, is to like, don't just let someone do your thinking for you.
I think that is a really good place to end it. Of, whether you're voting one way or not, you need to know what's happening, and stay informed, and go out there and read about stuff. And I will not for a second. I'm sure Eric will not for a second. Impose or pretend to you folks listening that we're incredibly knowledgeable or that we're staying informed. You need to be like us. That's not what we're saying at all. We can be better. We should be better. But that doesn't change the fact that everyone can be too. So,
and also one more thing I just thought of, like, as hard as it is, don't turn away from politics, because if you're really into politics as a kid, and then maybe the person you want to win doesn't win, don't say like, okay, well, politics isn't a part of my life anymore, and like the political climate, I'm just going to ignore it, because that's how they win, so to speak, and that's how they get away with a lot of the things people that you don't want to be elected are getting away with. So I think like when the person in office is someone you don't want to be in office, it's that much more important to focus on it, even though you're going to see a lot of stuff that you don't want to see on a daily basis.
I think I made the comment during the pre-show of like, politics, taxes, and insurance are like the three industries that don't want you to understand what they're doing. They're just like, leave us the heck alone. Just let us do our thing. And it's like, it's on you to learn about that. Learn how it's working. Don't take no for an answer. Don't just let bygones be bygones and let what happens. It's your job to, make a difference. And that's frustrating. That can be hard to do, especially in a system where it feels like your voice isn't heard, but it is, even if it doesn't feel like that. So
100%.
Anyways, folks, that's our episode. I apologize for being sick and my voice being weird. I apologize if it seemed like we were...
How dare you be a human being that's capable of getting sick, you jerk.
I tell you, man, we should do an episode on getting sick, because I did not get sick once when I was at PLU, and every time I go back to my parents' house, I get sick. It's the freaking worst. I have a lot to say about that. But I hope we weren't mixing our metaphors or mixing our messages too much on this episode. If we were, I feel like that's a true testament to the fact that we don't really have an agenda we're pushing here. We're kind of just bringing up a subject and then talking through it like real people. So that's what we got. Eric, anything else you want to say? You feel like we did a good day's work?
I think we've said enough. If we say any more, we're going to start talking about Donald Trump again, so we should end the podcast now before it happens.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been episode 30 of the Not Yet Adults podcast. Remember, you can find the podcast every Monday and Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time on YouTube, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and all other podcast services. We're also on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Yet Adults, as well as on our own subreddit, r/Not Yet Adults, which you should check out if you have the time. If you have even more time, head on over to iTunes or Apple Podcasts if you're on iOS. Leave us a rating and review, 5 stars or 4 stars if you're mean. It only takes a couple of minutes out of your day. It's not that big a deal for you, but it absolutely is a big deal for us. It could be the difference between someone seeing our little podcast or not. So if you could do that for us, we would really appreciate it, and it helps the podcast get listened to by more people. We will be back this coming Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time talking about something new, and we are very much looking forward to it. So thanks for listening. Get out there and vote. And until next time, this has been Not Yet Adults.
I want you.
Is that it?
Well, that's what Uncle Sam says.
He didn't say I want you, though. He said I want you and then something else. I want you has a different connotation to it.
Damn it.